The late afternoon sun hung low over Baton Rouge, Louisiana, casting long golden shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Lieutenant Imani Harper moved through the streets with a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of discipline and knowing exactly who you are. Her dark brown eyes scanned the neighborhood, familiar yet foreign, like a childhood home long abandoned. She hadn't been back in 7 years, not since she'd enlisted, not since she'd buried her mother. It was strange to see how little had changed. The same corner convenience store still advertised 2-for-1 sodas. The same barbershop with its faded sign. The same basketball court where kids played as if their lives depended on it. Laughter and voices, the smell of fried catfish from Mrs. Laverne's, it all surrounded her, pulling her back to memories she hadn't thought about in years. She adjusted the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't wearing anything that looked like a uniform, just a fitted t-shirt, cargo pants, and old sneakers, but even in civilian clothes she acted differently. Her shoulders squared to her chin, her stride measured, not something she could turn off. Her father used to call it a warrior's stance. She smiled faintly at the thought. He would be proud if he were still here. As she passed, a group of teenagers gathered outside the corner store. One of them, maybe 16, glanced up and looked back quickly, then nodded respectfully. "Are you in the military?" he asked. Imani paused, meeting the boy's eyes. "Something like that," she replied. The boy grinned. "I think my cousin's in the military. He walks like you." Before she could react, one of his friends called him inside, and just like that he was gone. She exhaled slowly. Moments like these reminded her why she fought, why she endured. She had spent years in places most people only saw in war documentaries, Kandahar, Mosul, Helmand. But here, on the streets of Baton Rouge where she grew up, the war seemed closer than ever. She was approaching a narrow alley when she heard footsteps behind her. Quick and determined. She turned and saw him, Malachi Rhodes. The man she had known so well, the man she had never thought she would see again. And his eyes were accusing. "Imani," he said, his voice strained. "You're going to leave without telling me?" She tightened her grip on her bag. "I don't think we have anything left to say." "You always do that, disappear without a word." He stepped closer, his eyes dark and angry. "You're hiding something. I know you're lying." Anger flared inside her. "I don't owe you an explanation, Malachi. You have no right to question my life anymore. I'm just trying to protect you. I don't need your protection." Her voice was sharp, her eyes flashing. "Have you forgotten? I'm the one who survived the war, not you. If you think you can control me, you'll learn your lesson the hard way." The air between them was tense, like a wire stretched to its limit. Finally, Malachi stepped back, but his eyes never left her. "You're not one to be messed with, are you?" he said, his voice lower but still full of emotion. "That's right," Imani replied, turning and walking away, leaving him standing there in the fading dusk. She led teams in the dead of night. Through chaos and enemy fire. Through sandstorms that swallowed up sound and light. And now she was home. The walking streets were both familiar and unfamiliar. She spent her 20s in a war zone. Trading her youth for courage and memories that could not be erased. Her 30s were an internal battle. Nameless nightmares and sudden memories that came flooding back. Trying to piece together a life torn apart by war. And now at 40 she was no longer sure what home meant. A sense of lostness clung to her like a shadow. But her thoughts were interrupted. A patrol car crept up beside her. It slowly crept out of position. In a neighborhood where cops often ran. Without looking back she kept walking. Pretending not to notice, but she knew what had to be done. What? The window rolled down, a hoarse voice called out. "Excuse me, ma'am." She stopped, turned around a little and saw him. Officer Derek Simmons. A white man with a mid-40s military haircut. Thick arms and eyes hidden behind reflective sunglasses. But she felt the gaze sweep over her. As if she were out of place. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked. Imani looked at him for a moment. Her expression was unreadable. She had met men like him before. Who saw a black woman's confidence and mistook it for a challenge. She shifted the strap of her duffel. "Just walking to the place," she raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize I needed a ride to walk my own street." Simmons didn't like that. His smirk faded a little. "We've had a few break-ins here," he said. "Gotta make sure everything's in order." Imani's gaze remained unwavering. "You see me breaking into something?" Silence. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned against the open window, breathing heavily. "Just doing my job." Imani exhaled through her nose, fighting the urge to shake her head. "Yeah, I'm just walking." She could feel the weight of the moment shifting. Simmons didn't want to talk. He was looking for control. And something about her. Whether it was his presence or the way she refused to shrink. Didn't sit right with him. She had two choices, continue to engage or walk away. But before she could decide, Simmons put the car in park. Imani didn't move. She was trained to assess threats, surroundings, escape routes, and right now, she wasn't just assessing a man in uniform. She was assessing a man who was getting too comfortable, pushing his authority. But she knew one thing: this was not a quiet street. Except for the hum of distant traffic and the occasional chatter from a nearby store, nothing else mattered in this moment. The tension between Imani and Officer Derek Simmons was thick, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to dissipate. She didn't move, didn't flinch. "I repeat," Simmons insisted, his voice less patient this time. Imani glanced at his hands. Simmons's right thumb rested near the latch of his holster, a silent warning, intentional or not, she recognized. She could feel the warmth of eyes on her. A few passers-by had begun to notice, some slowed, watching, waiting. She reached into her pocket, keeping her movements measured, careful. She pulled out her military ID and held it up, not showing it to anyone. Simmons squinted at the card, then back at her. "Military, huh?" His tone was unreadable. But Imani had met men like him before, men who saw a woman like her and decided that a uniform wasn't enough, a rank wasn't enough. "Where did you serve, exactly?" "I don't answer unnecessary questions," Imani replied, her voice calm but firm. Simmons exhaled through her nose, her lips pressing together into a thin line. Before she could react, he snatched the ID from her hand, turning it over between his fingers, a smug smile on his face. "Navy SEALs," he read aloud, stretching the words as if they were a joke. "Cute." A heat ran through Imani's chest, not anger, but a familiar unease. One she'd encountered hundreds of times before, in rooms filled with men who thought she didn't belong. She kept her voice tightly controlled. "Give me back my badge." Simmons studied her face, tilting his head slightly as if trying to decide whether she was worth bothering with. "You know," he said, "I've been on the force for 20 years. Seen all sorts of people walk through this neighborhood." He paused, his eyes fixed on her. "But never a Navy woman before." The insult was so blatant. It was so ridiculous that Imani almost laughed. But she held back. She wasn't giving Simmons what he was looking for. "You can run it through your system," she said firmly. "You'll find out soon enough." But that wasn't what Simmons wanted. He wanted a reaction. And when he didn't get one, he flipped his card, lips curling in mockery, as if he'd decided she was lying. "You expect me to believe that?" His tone was skeptical. "You've been out there fighting for this country, asking for a chance. Just a small chance." Imani caught the implication. And she saw the onlookers around her, their curious gazes changing. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. It had become something else. A young woman stood on the sidewalk, phone raised, recording everything. She made no secret. She wanted Simmons to see. That was the thing about power, it changed depending on who was watching. Simmons noticed. His shoulders squared, a small but obvious sign of tension. That shift in stance was a problem. "What are you doing?" he asked the woman on the phone, but she didn't answer. She just kept recording. Imani stood still, perfect in her stillness, with just a slight smile, not enough to provoke, but enough to let Simmons know she wasn't afraid. Now, Simmons was the one being watched. He glanced at Imani again, jaw clenched. "I don't like it when people try to make fun of me," he growled. "I'm doing my job, not putting on a show." "Then do your job," Imani said, her voice calm but sharp as a knife. Something dark flashed across Simmons's face. He stepped forward, just an inch, a small but calculated step, a challenge. Imani didn't move. "I don't know who you think you are," Simmons said, his voice low, trying to maintain his authority. "But I'm the one calling the shots here." Her smile deepened, but remained subtle. Just enough to let him know he'd made a mistake. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, her voice light as a breeze. And then Simmons did exactly what she'd predicted. He reached for her wrist. Bad idea. The moment Simmons's fingers touched her skin, Imani moved. Fast and precise. Not aggressive, not enough to be considered an attack, but enough to break free of his grip before it could fully form. A simple move. A demonstration of control. Simmons's eyes flashed with surprise. He hadn't expected it. And the crowd was getting bigger. The woman with the phone took a step forward, another step, and the camera was still rolling. A man across the street folded his arms, shaking his head, his face showing displeasure. A couple at the food cart had stopped eating completely, their eyes fixed on the scene. All eyes were on them. Imani sighed through her nose, trying to keep her composure. She had practiced restraint, had drilled discipline into her bones. Calm, always calm. But that didn't lessen the tension. Harper Simmons's voice rang out, carrying too much confidence, the arrogant kind of confidence that made his words seem like absolute power. "What do you think you're doing?" Imani barely blinked. "Avoid unnecessary contact," she replied, her voice even. Simmons's expression darkened. "You think this is a joke?" She tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" A flash of disappointment crossed Simmons's face. He had expected compliance, at least cooperation. Instead, he got resistance wrapped in calm, an unwavering calm. And that annoyed him. Simmons's hand moved toward his radio. "I need backup." Imani interrupted softly. "Backup for what?" Simmons's mouth tightened into a thin line. "For the uncooperative suspect." A scoff rose from the crowd. Someone muttered, "This is some bullshit before we catch them." The woman on the phone spoke up. "Uncooperative? You're the only one making noise here." Simmons's ears turned red, but he didn't turn around. He was too closed off and too consumed by his own pride. Imani recognized that. She had been in enough tense situations to know when a man was on the verge of exploding. And Simmons wouldn't back down. Not now. Not with so many eyes on her. She had to choose her next words carefully. "Officer Simmons," she said, calm but firm. "You're making a mistake." His nostrils flared. "What did you say?" "You made a mistake," Imani repeated, her voice unwavering. "And I think you know it." Simmons took a step forward, one too many. His hands moved behind him, where the handcuffs peeked out. Imani took a deep breath. She could feel the change in the air, the fragile moment before everything fell apart. She knew where this was going. Simmons wanted to make an example of her. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she wasn't doing what he expected. And she couldn't allow that. The crowd sensed the danger too. Whispers rose, phones raised higher to record. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Imani kept her eyes steady, her composure steady. But underneath, she was ready. Imani could feel her pulse steadying, each beat a distant drumbeat. Her focus was sharper than ever, her instincts honed to perfection. She had 3 choices before her, each with consequences. She could let him handcuff her, endure the humiliation, allow herself to be treated like a criminal in front of the entire neighborhood. Not an option. Running? That would force Simmons to give chase, and that would be even worse. She knew that if the situation escalated, neither of them would ever be the same again. That left only the third option. Imani chose it. Her voice was calm but firm, each word forged from cold steel. If you handcuff me, you'll regret it. Simmons's smile returned, but this time it was strained, forced. It wasn't confidence anymore, it was defense. But he'd made up his mind. His hands dropped to his belt, searching for the handcuffs, and it was the last mistake he made that day. The moment Simmons' fingers touched the metal, Imani moved. Fast. Smooth. Deliberate. Before he could react, she'd made a simple shift in stance, a step forward, a step to the side. Nothing more. Nothing less. But it was enough. Simmons staggered, his eyes widening as he realized he was no longer in control. Imani didn't attack. She didn't need to. All she did was slip out of his grip, neatly, precisely, making Simmons look ridiculous in front of the crowd. He looked like he was fumbling, stumbling over his own feet. And that was worse than any punch. The gasps from the onlookers confirmed it. Damn, she slipped right out of there, someone muttered. A young woman held up her phone, recording the scene with an unreadable expression. Simmons's face was flushed, his breathing quickened, his chest heaving as if he had just been insulted in the worst way imaginable. Imani stood perfectly still, her hands hanging limply at her sides. Officer Simmons, she said, her voice slow and careful. You're losing control of the situation. Simmons' jaw clenched so hard she thought his teeth might crack. She had humiliated him without touching him. And Simmons couldn't let that happen. His hand jerked behind his back, and Imani braced herself for what was coming. Imani exhaled through her nose, her eyes still calm, but underneath there was a tension building. Simmons's voice was sharp now, but cut by sheer frustration. Why resist arrest, he snapped, but the question itself sent a wave of whispers through the crowd. Arrest for what? A man near the corner store asked loudly. We all saw her not touching the guy. Simmons ignored them, but the whispers couldn't be ignored entirely. His fingers curled, itching to grab onto something, or someone. Imani had seen it before, a man backed into a corner, his pride threatened, desperate to regain his power. She gave him one last chance. You don't want to do this, she said evenly, her voice calm but serious. Think carefully. Simmons's breathing became heavier, his shoulders heaving with each angry movement. His pride screamed at him to take control, to prove his authority and put her where he thought she belonged. And then, he made his choice. He lunged, a bad move. Imani's body reacted before her mind could. Her feet moved, her arms reached out. In a split second, she caught his wrist in midair and twisted it, just enough to redirect the momentum without hurting him. And suddenly, it was Simmons who was off balance. In less than a second, she had him turned, his arm locked in an inescapable position. Imani hadn't used all her strength, she had even held back. But to the onlookers, to the cameras recording, and most importantly, to Simmons, it was a public humiliation. A man in uniform, beaten in broad daylight, in front of a crowd. By a woman he thought he could successfully threaten. Simmons's breathing hitched, his body stiff with shock and humiliation. Imani held him there for just a second longer, long enough for him to understand. Then she let go. Simmons stumbled forward before he could regain his balance, his arms swinging awkwardly, just long enough for every phone camera to catch the moment. The crowd erupted. "Oh my God, did she just flip him over?" a voice shouted. The woman filming shook her head, grinning. "I had every second of this." Simmons stood there, his entire being radiating humiliation. His hands were clenched, shaking with unshed anger. Imani remained as calm as ever. "Are we done?" she asked, her voice flat, unwavering. Simmons didn't answer. Couldn't answer. And then, a new voice rose from the crowd. "What the hell is going on here?" A second patrol car had just pulled up. Sergeant William Burke stepped out, older, more experienced. His demeanor was calm but authoritative, and from the way those piercing blue eyes scanned the scene, he knew something was very wrong. He looked at Simmons, flushed, breathing heavily, fists clenched, then at Imani, calm, unwavering, standing upright in the middle of the street. But they weren't alone now. The entire block was watching. Phones were on, conversations had stopped. Bystanders had become witnesses. Burke took a deep breath. He'd seen what was happening, or at least guessed it. But he turned to Simmons first. "Officer Simmons, explain." Simmons's jaw tightened, but no words came immediately. He was drowning in the humiliation, the embarrassment of being turned on him, in broad daylight, in front of so many eyes. Imani could see the internal struggle. Simmons wanted to lie, twist the story to make himself look like a victim. But then Burke's eyes drifted over the cameras, over the watching crowd. The sting of public humiliation spread. She resisted, Simmons finally said, his voice strained. "Not complying. Being aggressive." A mocking laugh came from a young woman filming. "That's a lie, and we all saw it." Burke didn't turn to look at her, but Imani saw the tension in his expression. He didn't believe Simmons either. "What happened, Miss Imani?" She didn't rush to answer. Her voice was clear, calm, but heavy. "He stopped me for no reason. Asked for my identification, which I showed. Then he accused me of lying about who I was." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "When I refused to let him handcuff me for no reason, he touched me. I just stopped him." Burke exhaled slowly. He was assessing, considering. He knew how fragile the situation was, a white cop, a black woman, a crowd with raised phones, a power struggle gone too far. And then his eyes fell on Imani. Her calm was not from defiance, but from a belief in the truth. In that moment, Burke realized, without another word, that he knew who was telling the truth. Lieutenant Harper Simmons still clutched the naval badge in his hand, but his expression changed little by little. At first it was confusion, then recognition, then regret. His entire body froze the moment her rank left Burke's mouth. It was over. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, as if they themselves couldn't believe what had just happened. Simmons' face was pale, his eyes wide, his posture rigid. Imani stood there, not blinking, not smirking, not gloating. She just waited silently. Burke's voice was quieter now but sharper than ever. "You're a Marine, aren't you?" "Yes, sir." Silence fell. Burke turned his gaze to Simmons, where his fingers twitched around the badge. But Burke didn't wait for an excuse. He turned to the crowd. "Does anyone have footage of this interaction?" At least 10 hands went up. A young woman held the phone, smiling knowingly. Her next words made Simmons' breath catch. "I did everything." He knew what was coming. Burke's voice dropped, but every word was sharp. "Officer Simmons, you are relieved of duty immediately." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the room. Disbelief was evident on everyone's faces. Simmons' face twisted, his hands clenched into fists. You can't be serious. I advise you to stop before you make things worse. Burke's tone was hard, an unmistakable warning. Simmons' nostrils flared, his entire body shaking with rage, but he had nothing left. No power, no honor. Imani looked at him one last time. There were no words, only understanding. She had won, and Simmons knew it. Burke turned to Imani, his voice losing its edge. Lieutenant Harper, do you wish to press charges? The air fell silent. Simmons could barely breathe, and the crowd leaned forward, waiting for a decision. Imani let the question sink in, letting its weight settle on Simmons like a final judgment. Then she exhaled softly. No. A wave of surprise rippled through the crowd. Simmons stared at her, stunned, not believing her ears. Burke studied Imani for a long moment, then asked again, "Are you sure?" Imani nodded, her voice soft but firm. I didn't come home to find a fight. I just wanted to walk around my neighborhood. The words hit hard. Burke sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, knowing full well what would happen to Simmons from here. Imani stood before Burke, her eyes sharp. She didn't ask in a sweet voice. She didn't need it. The internal review will likely suspend you. Her voice was calm, but each word was like a knife. It could be worse. Simmons looked sick. Burke didn't answer. No excuses. Imani wasn't surprised. That was no longer her concern. She turned, ready to leave. But then Simmons did something no one expected. You want to know why my voice is so stiff? His voice was hoarse, heavy. Imani paused. Not quite, just enough to look into his eyes. In them, she saw pain, disappointment, and something deeper. Her answer was simple, but carried the weight of a long journey. Because, she said softly, I taught you the lesson you needed to learn. And with that, she turned and walked away, without hesitation. Her footsteps were steady on the pavement, her shoulders square. She didn't have to turn to know that every eye in the crowd was watching her. The silence was tense. Behind him, Simmons stood still, his entire career crumbling around him. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. That's what happens when you mess with the wrong people. A few chuckles, a few whispers spread. The tension turned into something else, a moment that would not be forgotten. Burke stood still for a few seconds, his gaze locked on Simmons. Go home, Officer Simmons. Simmons didn't protest. He turned, walking stiffly, his hands clenched at his sides. The cameras followed him, recording the public humiliation. The car door slammed shut behind him. Burke exhaled, turning back to the crowd. The show's over, folks. A few people left, but the murmurs continued. A young woman holding a phone stared at Burke before lowering her camera. He's going back to duty in a few weeks, she asked, unimpressed. Burke didn't respond. He knew better than to make promises. Just send the footage in, he said before returning to the car. Imani kept walking, but she wasn't aimless. She wasn't the type to be easily rattled. Years of training, deployments, and high-pressure missions had honed her, built a strength inside her that wasn't easily shaken. But that didn't mean she wasn't feeling it. As she passed a store, she caught a glimpse of herself in the glass, and her eyes met with her own. And for a moment, something stirred inside her, but she didn't stop. Her steps were steady, as she always had been. Imani stepped out of the police station, the afternoon sun slanting through the rows of houses, bathing her in a pale yellow light. She stood there for a moment, letting her breathing slow. This victory, if it could be called that, did not bring the relief she had expected. Simmons was done. The footage was in, the evidence was undeniable. But deep in her chest, a fire still burned. Not anger. Frustration. Not just frustration at Simmons. Not just at today's confrontation. but at the fact that it was never really over. Even though she had left the battlefields of foreign lands, the battles followed her back home. Battles not with guns, but with prejudice, power, and injustice. And that weighed on her heart, like a cold stone. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, choose your battles, and win the ones that matter. Today, she had won. But how many more battles were ahead? She didn't know. And fatigue crept through her muscles. In the evening, Imani sat on the back steps of her father's old house. The wooden planks creaked softly under her weight. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and somewhere, the sizzling of something frying in a neighbor's kitchen. For the first time that day, she relaxed her shoulders. The screen door behind her opened, making a familiar sound. I always sit like this when I'm thinking. She didn't have to turn to recognize the voice. Uncle Ray came out, lowering himself onto the steps beside her. He placed a bottle of iced tea beside her, then uncorked his own, making a soft hiss. For a moment, they just sat there in silence. So you're in the paper, Ray said, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Imani smiled faintly, but not happily. I didn't mean to. Never, but trouble always finds us. She picked up the tea, her fingers tracing the cold condensation on its surface. It's never been a problem, but it's never been peace. Ray glanced at her. You handled it well today. Just like your father. That made her smile, if only briefly. Her father had always taught her that strength wasn't just about fighting, but knowing when not to fight. And today, she'd made the right choice. Simmons will feel this for a long time, Ray mused. But more than that, a lot of people saw what happened today. And they'll remember. Imani turned the tea around in her hands. But will it change anything? Or will we just keep fighting like this forever? Ray sighed, rubbing his chin. You're asking the wrong question. Not whether it will change anything. It's whether it changes anything. She let those words sink in. Maybe she hadn't changed the world today. But maybe she had changed something. Maybe someone in the crowd had seen it, and understood that they didn't have to bow to unjust authority. Maybe some officer would think twice before acting. Maybe even Simmons would have looked at himself. Although she doubted it. Ray nudged her. So what are you going to do now? Imani exhaled, setting down her tea. Keep going. Ray's smile was small, but proud. That's my girl. Because sometimes, the real fight isn't about winning or losing. It's about standing your ground, even when the world tells you to back off. It's about showing up, speaking up, and refusing to shrink. Because even if you can't change everything, you can change something. And sometimes, that's enough to start the change.